This is Tamara Rose Blodgett reading Blood Singers, Chapter 3, Present Day. Liquid lapped Julia and the water parted, ice replacing the subtle undulation of comfort she'd been under. She came to the surface of her consciousness in a nauseating wave. She became aware that she was drowning in hunger and weakness. Julia didn't have the strength to move. Loud voices assailed her. They floated around Julia, stabbing at her consciousness until she finally understood where she was. If she'd had the strength, Julia would have wept. The creatures that had stolen her life away were arguing about her again. I am phoning him. Gabriel must be made aware of what is happening here. Julia cracked open her eyes, wide and grainy. Her mouth felt like the Sahara Desert. She was so thirsty, her bones ached with it. How long had she been out? She is killing herself, the one named William said. His fists were clenched, and anxiety tightened his already stark features. Call him, ask him what we must do. If she is as important as you hypothesize, it is necessary, no? Pierce queried reasonably. She lay perfectly still, but they heard a change in her breathing and turned their silvered eyes to her. Julia had just enough energy to lift her forearm and cover her eyes. She would not look at them. Just kill me, she said listlessly. Without Jason, why go on? Julia couldn't bear to think of all of it right now. The shards of that nightmare would not be memory she would look at any time soon, if ever. Julia didn't hear them approach, but an icy hand clamped around her forearm gently and moved it off, eyes that ran with tears. Julia was surprised she had enough tears to shed. Her mind was so beleaguered with grief she could hardly breathe. Why didn't they just kill her now? After all, that's what they were good at. Killing. William tapped his cell to hibernate and pocketed it inside the jacket he wore. He breathed out in an elaborate exhale. They took a chance implementing this protocol. If they did not follow it to the letter, they would lose her. This girl, the blood singer from the Book of Blood, the rare one. He gave Pierce a full look as they walked together toward the girl. Julia watched them come, one dark and one light. Angels. They look like angels. Angels of death. Her arms long ago released, Julia lay there, unable to move a muscle. Only her eyes rolled in their sockets, tracking their approach. William crouched down, feeling the hollow on the underside of her wrist, where a thready pulse beat. She is close. It is a near thing. Pierce nodded. It must be you. You are the one with singer heritage coursing through your veins. Maybe you can bring her back. William had hoped that Julia would come around these past months, but they could tarry here no longer. The weir drew nearer, circling like sharks in water saturated by blood. This coven grew restless with her presence. Blood singers were a stick to stir the cauldron of trouble. He had already waited too long. Julia was weak. Julia looked up at him with eyes of liquid gold, and he breathed through his mouth, hoping the scent of her would not impede what he must do. It was a risk William must accept. Julia saw William look at her intently and kept her eyes open with effort. Something was building. It thrummed deep in her bones, like a call. Julia whimpered. She hated to be weak, but knew what they were capable of. She watched as his eyes drank in the sight of her, then his fangs elongated, escaping his mouth. She opened her own to scream, but nothing came out. His eyes tightened at her expression as William tore into the flesh of his own wrist. Black blood began oozing out of his damaged forearm and flowed down, dripping onto her neck. The droplets splattered like hot candle wax on her skin. Drink, William said, lowering his wrist down to her mouth. Julia shook her head. With her ebbing strength, she clamped her lips together in a futile effort to not do what was before her. William's eyes flicked behind Julia and he grunted, frustrated. Hold her, William said, with a voice filled with regret. Large hands clamped onto either side of Julia's head, and she was helpless to move in the jaws of their hold. Just helpless, Julia seethed with frustration. The poison of his body poured into her mouth in a steady stream, and she fought, trying to move her head, but steel bands of flesh held Julia in position. He pressed his forearm onto her mouth, and with his other hand he pinched her nostrils together, and Julia sucked the blood down into her throat as she began to clench her teeth around his arm. William didn't react like she thought he would. He dragged her against himself, Pierce releasing her in surprise. Her mouth on his arm, clamping down. Julia bit down with everything she had. His eyes dilated, the silver disappearing to be replaced by deep crimson. William pressed her against him, his fangs completely extended. William, control yourself, Pierce yelled, coming for him. Julia hung on for dear life as she watched those black eyes look at her with such longing, such loneliness. As he reared to strike, a fist crashed into the side of his temple. Her mouth was torn from his forearm, her body sliding off his lap onto the floor. Julia lay in a small heap on her side as a fire burnt inside her. It became a delicious roar within. She was being consumed by heat. It burned and itched. She melted into the intense warmth, her consciousness narrowing. As Julia's mind dimmed, she saw the other creature check on William, his black eyes shut. The creature named Pierce looked in Julia's direction, and he was sideways. Julia knew what else he was. Vampire. She fell into a deep abyss of grayness, her mind shielding her from what Julia could not handle. She floated swiftly down the memory pipeline, grateful for the escape it gave her. Last day. Jason had his fingers entwined in Julia's, their last day of school finally here. His plane tickets bought for Vegas. They were going to do it. Julia looked up at him and smiled. He looked into the light gold depths and almost stumbled. She always had that effect on him. He'd been drawn to her from the beginning. A small furrow stood between her brows. Julia's hand came to her temple, rubbing. Jason pulled her over to the side of the hall, the sea of bodies and backpacks jostling past, an excited buzz thrumming in the halls. He slid his palm underneath her honey-colored hair and wrapped the back of it on her neck, gently kneading the soft skin. "Is it the headaches again?" Jason asked. Jules had been having these bone-crusher headaches. Jason thought it was the stress at home. Trying to plan a secret elopement could take its toll on a girl. He smirked. "You really care," she said, giving him a mock scowl, putting her hands on her hips. Her luscious hips, Jason thought. "No, I was just thinking all of your super secret spy moves you're pulling around Lily are getting kind of old." He cocked an eyebrow. She nodded. "True, but actually," Julia looked down at her hands that had found their way to Jason's hips, and she couldn't look away. A blush stole over her face. Jason put a gentle finger under her chin and raised it until their eyes met. Chocolate meeting gold. "What is it?" She shoved her erotic impulses away and concentrated on his question instead, the blush still staining her cheeks pink. Jason saw the high color marking her cheekbones and wondered what she'd been thinking about. He opened his mouth to repeat the question, and Julia interrupted. "It's the dreams. I'm having them again." "Oh," Jason said, pulling her in against his body. He hadn't liked the dreams. He wasn't going to tell her, but he'd begun having some of his own. And they were goddamn doozies. "Get a room," Kevin yelled, walking by, arms slung around Cynthia. Jason gave Kevin the finger and Julia grabbed it in the air. "Don't," she hissed, giving him another scowl. Jason threw up the other hand and flipped him another bird. "You're impossible," Julia said sternly. Then she smiled. She began laughing and convulsed into a stream of irrepressible giggles. "That's so helpful, Jules. You're so on it." Julia looked at Jason, and he was standing there in full view of the world, giving Kevin the double finger send-off. "Oh my God." Julia clutched her sides, howling. She was bent over until Julia noticed a pair of hot pink boots come into her line of sight. She grabbed Sin's sweater and hauled herself up. "Hey, asswipe, you're not sensing any adults around?" Kevin asked. Jason dropped his hands as one of their teachers made his way toward them in a huff of righteous adult indignation. "Terrell." Great. Instead of calming down, it had the opposite effect on, and Julia continued laughing, tears streaming down her face. Terrell lurched up to the group. Taking a look at the Wade girl, doubled over in fits of hysterical giggling, he dismissed her. It was the basketball boys that he had his attention trained on. He didn't care if the Caldwell boy had got an A in his class. There was something fishy about them, especially that never-apply-herself girlfriend of his. He got right up in Caldwell's grill, momentarily nonplussed that the kid had him by 4 inches. "Listen here, Caldwell. I don't give a good lick about how great you think you are, or that it's your last day here. This isn't the court. You don't own the school, the halls, nothing. Act like an adult and maybe, just maybe, you'll become one someday." Terrell had sobered Julia up, and she didn't like how he was talking to Jason. Big surprise, she didn't like Terrell that much anyways. She and Sin had their arms crossed, and Kevin stood looming over Terrell. He didn't seem intimidated, and Julia suddenly remembered a term that Aunt Lily used, little man syndrome. Maybe he had a dose of that, she wondered. "We clear?" Terrell asked, but he wasn't really asking. He was commanding. He required a certain kind of response. "Oh, please don't get nailed on the last day," Julia thought, seeing Jason's fist clench and loosen. She watched him notch down his anger at Terrell and her shoulders relaxed. Looked like things were going to settle down, I guess. Then Terrell looked at her, really looked at her, starting at her head and ending at her feet, sweeping over her private parts with a lingering look. Gross. Hey, perv, Sin squeaked. Why don't you go die somewhere? But it was Jason that knotted his fist in the teacher's collar and dragged him close. Don't you look at her that way, he said in a low voice, violence swirling beneath the surface. Kevin was prying his fingers off Terrell. Don't, he deserves it, but don't, he's pushing it. Their eyes met and Jason released Terrell reluctantly, pulling Julia behind him protectively. He looked smug. I knew you'd mess up. This is all I needed to get you exactly where I want you. Jason was confused. He'd seen the perv look at Julia and some of the other girls, but what didn't have to do with today? Why had he been so overt with Julia? His eyes narrowed on the teacher. Jason planted his legs apart, hands on his hips, looking around once to make sure Julia was behind him and safe. This guy had lost it. Kevin hit him in the arm and Jason's face went back to Terrell as Sin gasped. Jason became focused on the gun that was naked in Terrell's hand. What the hell was this? Jason thought, backing away. Julia, a warm presence behind him. Julia wasn't laughing now, as kids in the hall who had just been thinking how much trouble Jason was going to be in scattered like beetles out of a jar, screaming as they ran down the hall. Julia's headache slammed into her uncontrollably, spearing into her temple at a fever pitch, but it was the frenzied gaze of the teacher that she could not look away from. His beady hazel eyes shifted between the three kids, seeking. Finally, he caught a glimpse of Julia behind Jason and said, "It's you. If you were not here, then I could stop having this pain. The pain would stop," he said, brandishing the gun in the air, kids slamming themselves on the hallway floor. Julia felt something integral slip into place, the pain sliding away and becoming a burning mass. "Hey, whack job," Kevin said, going for the gun at the same time that Jason did. It wasn't choreographed, and as their bodies moved, a gap opened and Terrell pointed the barrel at Julia. All that focus, a warm liquid pain that she'd buried for the moment, came to her in a sliding push. With nothing but raw emotion, Julia looked at the black hole of the gun and mentally shoved as the hammer pulled back. It clicked. Time slowed down, Jason batting the gun away even as the bullet rushed toward Julia. Sin screaming in the background and Kevin landing on Terrell, their bodies crashing to the floor. Julia moved as the bullet entered the curtain of her hair instead of the fragile bones of her face, its course veering at the last moment, and she fell sideways from the trajectory. Hitting Sin, they both stumbled into the lockers. "Julia," Jason hollered, sprinting to her side, kicking the gun away as he came. His eyes frantically took in her body, checking for damage. She was unscathed, miraculously. As sirens wailed in the background, Jason turned around, leaving Julia in Sin's arms, and grabbed a fistful of hair on the top of Terrell's head. Using it like the dull side of a hammer, Jason picked his head up and slammed it into the floor. Again and again. Cops came and pulled Jason off, but the damage was done. Terrell lay in a pool of his own blood, spreading into the souls of all who had gathered. Chapter 4. Julia, a voice whispered to her as if through a tunnel. She came awake in stages, still feeling like she was in the school hallway. watching Jason beat Tyrell's head into the floor until it split open like an egg. Julia opened an eye and looked into a silver one. Reflective, she flinched. Her captors, the vampires. Once a myth, now Julia believed through hard evidence and even harder experience. Even as his eyes clenched from her reaction, William's expression showed cautious relief, and he stroked a wisp of hair away from her temple. Julia found her voice. "Don't touch me." His hand paused, then finished the movement. William stood, and Julia looked around, taking in the room for the first time. She'd never allowed herself to care about her surroundings. The one named Pierce loomed into view, and she shrank back. "We will not harm you," he began. "Right. You guys are so harmless," Julia said in a voice husky with disuse. William and Pierce looked at each other. Finally, William said, "We did. I did what I had to pull you out of your dreamscapes. If I had not done that," he shrugged impossibly broad shoulders, "you would have buried your psyche forever, and there was no feeding you, hydrating you, until you ceased to exist," Pierce finished for him. Julia tried to sit up and succeeded, barely. She felt better, actually. Who were they to play God, anyway? Maybe Julia didn't want to exist. Had they thought about that? They watched her warily. Julia swung her legs off the bed she'd been lying on. Tentatively, she put her feet on the rough, wooden surface and stood. The blood rushed to her head, causing her vision to swim in streamers of dull colors before her eyes. Julia commanded her legs to hold her even as they folded. A blur of gray reached her, and Julia was swooped up in the arms of the hateful vampire, William. "You're too weak to walk," he stated in a voice that reverberated through her breastbone. Melodic. Low. The tone affected her. Julia didn't know why, but his nearness frightened her, and she saw the reflection of it etched on his features. Her emotion pained him, that she was afraid. "Let me down," she whispered. "Pierce, get Susan again." In her periphery, Julia saw a blur of color and heard a far-off door open and shut. They stared at each other, the bloodsinger and the vampire. "Why am I here?" Julia asked, resisting the deep pull that emanated from her body to his. Julia didn't know what it was, but it was fully organic. Needy. Julia felt liquid fingers sink into her through her skin, deep in her marrow, clinging to her consciousness like cobwebs. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. When Julie finally opened them, William gave her his steady regard. "You are safe within this coven." "I am not safe with you. I will never be safe again." William flinched, knowing that Julia could not separate their acquisition of her with the violence that had surrounded it. She was lumping the groups together, the were and vampire. Now was not the time to correct her misapprehension, not when the ware's rancid breath was upon their doorstep, when the whole coven was on the chasm of bloodlust from her months here. The fragrance of her rarity permeated every nook and cranny that the haven provided. Even the most immune amongst them, of bloodsinger descent themselves, were itching with need. The time was ripe to make haste to his home kiss, the coven where he had always been. Just thinking of the city and what lay underneath it made his sluggish heart beat faster. Primal adrenaline surging through his limbs. Julia responded to his physicality, taking a sharp inhale, her body tingling in reaction to his thoughts. It's the blood share. It will pass, William said, intuiting her body's response. Put me down, she repeated. William gently put her on her feet, his hand gripping her bony elbow, which had become like a twig since they'd taken her. Julia longed to tear it away from him, but knew that she could hardly stand. She fumed where she stood, trying not to think about the blood she drunk from her husband's murderers. The memory encroached on her mind ruthlessly, and Julia shut it down like all the others she didn't want to see. Biting the inside of her cheek, blood welled inside her mouth like sour copper, and Julia made a slight noise. William looked at her sharply, sucking in his breath, and began to breathe through his mouth. Julia gave a genuine smile for the first time since this ordeal had begun, as a terrible idea began to take shape inside her mind. Escape. Just as Julia would press her advantage, a large woman burst through the door, and Julia's heart skipped a beat, racing inside herself. She swayed, and William pulled her gently against him. Julia didn't resist. There was no use. But she would soon permanently resist. Oh, so permanently. Caregiver. Susan looked at the blood singer that the runners had acquired some months past, and it was the first time the girl hadn't been half unconscious. Countless bowls of soup, water poured down her throat, sponge baths and dressings she'd shared with the girl. But she still continued to look at Susan as if she were a stranger, for she was. The trauma surrounding the acquisition had been so overwhelming, the girl had yet to recover. When she was finally dying, William had been beside himself to save her and been given the green light. Bloodshare. He had done it, even with the potential for scrambling the wires of his quarry. William had done it. Now she stood. Now Julia looked as if she might survive. Even Susan could see beneath the dishevelment and scrawny physique to the healthy girl she had been. She would be well again, Susan vowed. She had to be. Julia was the rare one. Susan's eyes flicked to the pale, moon-shaped scar on the girl's forehead. She approached Julia and took her gently from William's arms, his hands trailing reluctantly from her body. Susan glanced at William, the feral vestiges about him still present. "You do well to leave us for a time," Susan said significantly, and William nodded. Heaven knew he was having to stretch his limits with her fresh blood, a darkly blooming fragrance in the room, suffocating his reasoning. His directives. William walked away, the pull of his blood in Julia's body beating in time with his heart. It felt like warm taffy as he moved through the door, swimming upstream against it. His hand landed on the doorknob. Julia watched the vampire turn the knob, stiffen with hesitation, and quickly slip through. Susan breathed a sigh of relief when the vampire left. Julia tried to pull away, but Susan gripped her upper arm, fingers encircling the whole of it. Julia glared at her. "Take your hands from me." Susan smiled. "Listen to me," she began, her eyes boring into Julia's. "I am not like them. But you know that, don't you?" Julia didn't answer. She was not going to cooperate with any of it. "I am human." "Yeah, whatever. You work for them, that's all the info I need." "Who do you think got soup down your throat, bathed you, put clothes on you, Julia stared at her in horror. Susan had touched her when she was unconscious. Julia studied her closely. There was something almost familiar about her. Memories assaulted Julia in a torrent. Being in a tub and floating, this woman washing her. Ugh. Julia thought of the intimacy all that entailed and wanted to throw up. Julia remembered the food that she'd been spoon-fed woodenly. She wanted to die. She still did. Susan continued to look at Julia, watching the emotions and thought processes flood her face, filling it with recognition and understanding. Susan nodded. You remember? Yes, Julia finally replied through clenched teeth. Not a very grateful sort, are you? Julia tore her thin arm free, legs trembling. I didn't ask for anyone to care for me, she said in a fierce voice, the first hot tears falling. You should have let me die. That's all I want. I want to die. Susan was moved with compassion. This waif with such bottled up emotion and aggression had lost too much in too soon a time. They would have to start from nothing with her, ground zero. Susan crossed her arms and stared at Julia, who glared back, raising a hand to move her tangled hair behind her ear. Well, my dear, you're not going to die. On the contrary, my job is to get you living and healthy for transport. Despite her commitment to be contrary, Julia heard herself ask, Transport? Where? Her lip quivered, on the brink of crying harder. Seattle. You were acquired by that coven. Julia's vision wavered, tripling. She began to fall, and Susan screamed, William. Suddenly she was held in arms of warm steel. Julia's heart slowed and her body calmed. Her chemistry lulled by his closeness. Just before Julia crossed the threshold into unconsciousness, her mind told her what she feared most. Bloodshed. Her body, a traitor to her mind. Somehow, she was connected to her captor, whether Julia wanted to be or not. Julia faded, the tailspin of knowledge following her down into the spiral of her dreams of before.